this. Daniel began his career as a mathematics professor at the University of Chicago before becoming an organizer and then an elected official. He served as a member of the Illinois House and then the Illinois Senate and ran an insurgent grassroots campaign for the Democratic nomination for governor, coming in second in a crowded field. His campaigns and legislative service have all featured a strong commitment to public engagement, public reform, and economic justice. Daniel, thank you so much for being with us today. And I will let you tell me when you'd like me to switch over to the screens and slides that you brought.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you for the generous invitation and for assembling such a wonderful group. So many of my friends and so many organizations that I love are involved in this event. I'm just really delighted that there are so many people who want to participate in this conversation, which I think, you know, we sit here speaking during the Democratic convention as all eyes are understandably throughout this country on a presidential election. And I certainly wouldn't encourage anyone to lack interest in that presidential election. Yet we have this kind of technical sounding referendum in Illinois that I just cannot strongly enough state the importance of. So I'm very excited to see a large group of people here willing to talk about it. And I do want to be very direct about something before we even get started, which is that, you know, we've now for the last 40 minutes heard a series of, in my opinion, really inspiring visions about equity and justice and allusions to the kind of deeply embedded complex inequities that are riven throughout our society and that make outcomes so profoundly unjust in so many different ways. And I wish I could tell you that the referendum that we're going to have the opportunity to vote on this November and the discussion that we're going to have tonight gets at all of those inequities. But that wouldn't be true. It doesn't get at all of them. What it does do, though, is get at a very specific, completely voluntary inequity that the state of Illinois has been piling on top of each of the others. And so that may be a disappointment, that may make this conversation less exciting for some, but it also gives us an advantage as we go about the effort of persuading our friends and neighbors and relatives the importance of voting yes. You don't need to have a deep, complex analysis of the kind of injustices that were involved in the founding of this country or the history of this country. You just need an extremely basic sense of fairness and an understanding of what today's Illinois tax system actually does. And with those two things and everything else wiped off the table, I think we can persuade most people that this is just simply the right, sensible, common sense thing to do. And so if you don't mind indulging my technological incompetence, it would be wonderful if you wouldn't mind sharing your screen. I've already been exposed as a technological incompetent once during the course of this session, but kind of accidentally fleeing my breakout room in the middle of my own sentence, talking about my own past experience. So my apologies to Rita and Megan. I look forward to continuing the discussion with you another time, but here the controls are out of my hands and all of you are in better shape as a result. I want to start by showing the graph that in my view tells the entire story. Because the truth of the matter is that when we contemplate passing or trying to pass a tax-related referendum, many people we encounter will first instinctively have the reaction of, gosh, isn't the Illinois tax system already pretty unfair? And the answer is yes. This is something that sometimes people who've been supporting necessary steps like an increase in the flat income tax rate that we enacted in 2017 or that was enacted in 2011, people have kind of found it uncomfortable to acknowledge that yes, our tax system in Illinois is really unfair, but today we can say honestly and clearly, we have an unfair tax system and that's what the problem we're trying to solve. So let me show you how unfair it is. What this chart in front of you shows is the percent of your total income that you pay in tax to Illinois and your localities. In other words, if you make $100,000 a year and you pay in total tax to the state government and your school district and the county and the municipality and the township and everybody else, if your total tax bill out of that $100,000 was $10,000, then you'd be paying total $10,000 in tax to state and local governments. And what this chart does is it shows for different categories of people in the Illinois economic reality, how much are they paying? And what it shows you basically is the more you make, the less you pay. I say it again, the more you make in Illinois, the less you pay. So the poorest quintile, the 20% at the very bottom of the income scale, they're paying almost between 14 and 15% of their income in tax to state and local governments. People who make a little bit more pay a bit less, and so on and so forth. And then when you get to the top 5%, they're paying quite a lot less, and the top 1% are paying way less, to the extent that people in that top 1% are paying half of what people in the bottom 20% are paying. So I'll say it again. The truly wealthy in Illinois pay half what the poorest pay. And I'm stressing this again and again and again because I, like, frankly, many of the people who've already spoken in this discussion, have really ambitious goals when it comes to economic justice. I'm a progressive, and I fight for very progressive taxation and spending of public resources. But you don't have to be all that progressive to see that this chart in front of you is utterly absurd. If you ask your typical independent or Republican, if you ask your typical self-identified true conservative, hey, should the rich pay half what the poor are paying in tax? They would say that's a bad idea. They would say that's a bad idea. It doesn't make sense, not only to progressives like me, it doesn't make sense to almost anybody once you say it. If the rich are paying half what the poor are paying, something must be wrong. And so the question then we might ask ourselves is, hey, what's wrong? What's the problem? What created this preposterous graph that's in front of you? And I just want to walk through it for a moment, if you don't mind. There's lots of different taxes and fees that people pay. There's, all kinds of use taxes and esoteric fees, but there's really three big taxes that constitute the great majority of the revenue that most people pay to state and local government. The first one, the one that most people are probably most annoyed about, is the property tax. Well, how are property taxes structured? If you think about it for a moment, you realize that the less you make, the more of your income you're probably spending on housing, and therefore the more of your income you're spending on property tax. Someone who's making $50,000 a year may have a property tax bill that takes a real bite out of their income, whereas someone who's making $5 million a year, no matter what kind of house they have, it's going to be a smaller share of their income that they have to pay in property tax. And so the property tax, just by how it's structured, asks more of the poor and the middle class than of the wealthy. That's not an Illinois problem. There's other stuff wrong with the property tax in Illinois that's specific to Illinois, but the basic fact that the way property taxes are structured expects more of poor and middle class people than the wealthy is just how property taxes exist in almost every place in the world where they have property tax. And so this graph that you have in front of you is the kind of graph you would expect a property tax would produce. It asks a lot of the working poor whose rent is significantly increased because of the property tax that their landlord is paying that gets passed through. And middle-class homeowners are paying a lot in property tax, but the very rich, it's not really a big deal for them because their income is so high, it just swamps whatever they're paying in property tax. Okay, so that's one tax that we pay a lot of, the property tax, and the graph is going to look like this. It's just how it's designed. It's what a property tax is. How about the sales tax? That's the next big tax that we pay a lot of, and guess what? It's the same kind of situation. People who are living paycheck to paycheck, people who are working and poor and trying to make ends meet, if they're fortunate enough to get a $500 bonus, they're going to spend a lot of that money in the community and then pay sales tax on that new money they're spending. If a hedge fund manager, oh, sorry, Arena's saying she's not seeing the charts changing. They're not. There's just only one chart. This is a very, very unpyrotechnic presentation. There will be 3 slides. We will spend like 80% of the time on this one. And you can ignore everything I'm saying because if this picture is burned into your mind at the end of this, I think that's the most important message. But as I was saying, if someone who's on the left-hand side of this chart or the middle of this chart gets a raise, they're likely to spend a lot of that extra money and pay sales tax on the new expenditures that they're incurring. Whereas if a hedge fund manager who's already making $10 million a year makes another $1 million a year, he's not going to go to the corner hardware store and buy more screwdrivers. He's going to buy more vacation homes in Switzerland and Rembrandts in auctions that take place in London. And so once again, just like the property tax, the sales tax produces a picture just like this. It just naturally asks more of the poor and the middle class than the wealthy. So other states, and frankly, the United States government and most countries around the world, they see this, they understand this, they know that the money they bring in through sales tax is pretty unfairly tilted in favor of the wealthy. The money they bring in through property tax is pretty unfairly tilted in favor of the wealthy. And so the only thing that they can do to level that playing field is to take the income tax and do the opposite. To take the income tax and say, listen, if you don't make much, if you're working poor, if you're middle class, you'll pay less. But the truly wealthy can pay a higher rate on the income tax. What that would do is create a chart that looks exactly the opposite of this. The right-hand bars would be the highest, the left-hand bars would be the lowest. And then it would at least be possible to say, even though the sales tax and the property tax those burdens fall disproportionately on the middle class and the poor, hey, the income tax does the opposite. And so there's a shot at balancing it all out when you add them all up and imagine what someone's total tax paid looks like. That's what normal states do. That's what the federal government does. It's what many, many, many countries do. In Illinois, we can't do that. In Illinois, no matter what we want to do, no matter what the candidates who run for the legislature promise to do, no matter what the public wishes to see done, we have no choice but to ask every single person to pay the same income tax rates. And right now it's 4.95%. Doesn't matter if you make $10,000 or $10 million or frankly $500 million, you're paying the same income tax rate. And that is not only the way the tax code works today, that's locked into the Constitution, and it cannot be changed without amending the Constitution. And that fact in the Constitution is what gave rise to this transparently unjust reality. This unjust reality that, by the way, most people feel. Most people feel like the system in Illinois isn't really giving working people a fair shake. Hey, guess what? It doesn't, because the income tax isn't allowed to do the right thing, because the Constitution that was written in 1970 does not permit it to do so. The referendum on the ballot this November is simply a referendum to remove that provision from the Constitution and allow us to do what most states are already doing, what Wisconsin and Iowa and Missouri and Kentucky are already doing, and say, hey, listen, the very wealthy ought to pay a bit more. The very wealthy ought to pay a somewhat higher tax rate than working people who are already struggling to get by. And I mentioned all these neighboring states that already do this, and I think this is important to say, because again, I know that I'm a very progressive person, and some people may look and say, oh, well, Daniel Biss is for this. That wouldn't make a moderate swing voter all that impressed. The thing that we're trying to do with the Illinois Constitution is already on the books in Alabama and North Dakota. It can't be that far left. It's actually just the common sense way to design an income tax code. And almost every state that has an income tax does it. And almost nobody in the federal government, in the entire Republican caucus in Congress, would propose that we ought to have a flat tax there. They all agree, let's ask the wealthy to pay a higher rate. All we're saying is let's bring Illinois into that consensus that seems to exist almost everywhere else. But the thing that we'll be voting on in November is not merely an abstract theoretical question, do you believe in a different structure of taxation? The legislature and the governor did something that, in my opinion, is very smart. They said, let's not ask people to vote on an abstract theory. That's a lot, frankly, to ask someone to believe in. Let's put in the law in advance what the tax rates will become should this referendum pass. So when we're going to go vote in November or October, we're going to be asked, do you want to change the Constitution to allow a fair tax? But guess what? If we say yes, then when January 1st arrives, there will already be a new tax code. And now, if we could move to the next slide, I want to share with you what that tax code is going to look like. Perfect. So as I mentioned, today, everybody pays 4.95%. Everybody, whether you make $5,000 a year or $5 million a year. What will go into effect under the law already on the books, should the referendum pass in November, is in front of you. And there's obviously a blizzard of numbers, and there's two different tables, one for single filers, one for joint filers. I know it's a lot to look at, but the important thing to notice is that the numbers don't go above 4.95% until someone makes more than $250,000 a year. So for people making under $250,000 a year, if you're making under $250,000 a year, you'll get a tax break. You'll be paying somewhat less. And for folks who make over $250,000 a year, they'll be paying somewhat more. And you can see exactly what the rates are, but I do think that those facts are important because, again, and I don't dispute this, a lot of people in Illinois, working people, feel like they're already paying more than they can afford. They're already having tremendous trouble getting by, and they're frankly skeptical of the question of whether they ought to be paying even more, given what they're feeling in their families and in their lives right now. And the answer is they won't have to unless they're already making over $250,000 per year. And that's, by the way, 3% of households. So 97% of households will be paying less, and then 3% would be paying more. So that sort of makes it seem kind of simple. 97% will be better off, 3% from a selfish standpoint might not be as well off. Why is this thing going to be hard to pass? Well, of course, if only politics were that simple. So that's what the rates will be. And I want to say a word about the consequence on the next slide, if you don't mind. Because obviously the backdrop, and I think this was described in many of the opening presentations, but certainly the presentation from the League, I think, focused on it most directly. Our state has budget problems. We have serious debt problems, and we have an underinvestment, in my view, in critical services, especially education, human services, and healthcare. And so part of the question is, what do we get out of this as a state, as a people? What do we gain? And this slide is, I think, really explains the importance of the benefit. Obviously, now our state is in a kind of uncharted fiscal waters because of the coronavirus pandemic and the consequence on the economy and tax receipts. But until then, our structural deficit was about $3.2 billion. That means if you just chart it out year after year without any policy change, what we would be expecting to bring in tax and what we'd be expecting to spend in kind of ongoing state obligations and kind of maintenance of expenditures in areas like education and healthcare and so forth. If you just compare how big was that deficit going to look, it's going to look like about $3.2 billion every year that we don't have that we need. Well, this fair tax code that I described on the previous slide would bring in $3.4 billion a year. In other words, this is really designed to close that structural deficit that's been built into the budget here in Illinois. So now, let's just recap for a second. This is a tax system, one that asks the wealthy to pay a little bit more while giving the poor and the middle class a bit of a break, that is analogous to what most states in the country already have. It's something that makes sense to most people once you explain it to them. Then you enact these tax rates and you bring in $3.4 billion, which is really designed to close that structural deficit that we had. And so the reaction might be, well, what's the catch? How could it be that you give 97% of households a break and only ask 3% of households to pay more, and yet you're somehow able to bring in the $3.4 billion to close that structural deficit? How could that be? And you know, that if there were a catch, the catch would be that the rate that we were asking that top 3% to pay was so high that it was kind of out of whack and economically unfeasible, right? If we were to ask the top 3% to pay a 97% tax rate, you might say, okay, I don't know if they're going to go for that. That might create a problem. But guess what? The top rates you saw on the previous slide, they were all less than 8%. And guess what people are paying in Wisconsin at the top? 7.65%. Guess what the top rate is in Iowa? Over 8%. So this system that would be created would give 97% of households a break. It would modernize our tax system, bring us in line with other states. It would ask the wealthy just to pay what they'd already be paying if they moved north across the border to Wisconsin or west across the border to Iowa. And in doing that, close the structural deficit. And so honestly, it's pretty hard to argue with once you lay the basic facts out. But of course, in the context of a campaign with lots of money being thrown around and a lot of money at stake, frankly, not everyone's going to hear the facts. And so for me, the benefit of doing this presentation was just to give us a chance to talk together about some of the realities and maybe to debunk some of the myths if y'all are interested in having that discussion. Because the other thing about this referendum that I think is critical to say is, you know, it's relatively hard to find somebody these days who doesn't know if they're going to vote for Donald Trump or Joe Biden. That's a decision that most people have more information than they want about. But when it comes to this issue, people have access to less information, they know less, and as a result, many more are on the fence. And that gives us the extraordinary power to share, not just in the conventional campaign way of calling through lists of strangers, though of course that's important to do as well, but to share with our friends, with our relatives, with our coworkers, with our neighbors, to share with the people in our lives who know us and trust us some of these basic facts they're not going to hear anywhere else. In order for this referendum to be successful, I think all of us who care passionately about it are going to have to share that message. And I hope that tonight is an opportunity for us to all hone our abilities to share it effectively. So with that, I'd love to turn this conversation over to anyone with thoughts or questions or feedback.
Will you address these estimates of revenue and deficits now that there is a new economic reality?
Everything's worse. You know, I'm not in the legislature anymore, so I don't have up to the minute kind of economic reporting from the groups that did. I'm not in the legislature anymore, so I'm more at liberty to say those forecasts were a lot better than nothing, but a lot worse than accurate. And I think the truth is we just don't know. The human toll of this pandemic is, I think, already unpredictable and devastating, and the economic toll is completely unknown for many reasons, most importantly because duration is very unclear. As an aside, I'll say that without federal help, I think all states and local governments are going to be in completely unacceptable situations, and that's part of why this discussion in Washington that's gone so poorly is so critical. But, you know, fundamentally, I don't know that it really impinges much on this question. The question before us is, do we want a better, fairer tax system that will bring in $3 billion extra, or do we want to pass on the opportunity to have that? And I think that question is true, you know, in the pretty bad fiscal condition Illinois was in February, or the worst fiscal condition that every state is in now. You know, our options are status quo or something better. I say we pick the better thing.
Thank you. I have a question from Judy Ball, and I'm just going to go ahead and read these. Does this change or open the door for taxing some retirement income in the future? Or is that idea a fear tactic from the opposition? For the record, I believe those in retirement making more than a comfortable amount should be paying state income tax.
No, that is a fear tactic from the opposition. And it's of a piece with the opposition's favorite fear tactics, which are to name very specific things that this proposal doesn't do and pretend that A, those things could not be done today, and B, that passing this would make them easier later, right? So the legislature could pass a retirement income tax tomorrow if they wanted to. They don't want to because it's a very unpopular idea, because there's a lot of older adults, retirees living on fixed incomes who couldn't afford to pay it. That's why it's not a popular idea. But they could do it tomorrow if they wanted to. Passing this amendment doesn't make it easier or harder to tax retirement income. In the meantime, the governor and most legislators I know have pledged up and down never to do that. So whether this passes or not, I know they're going to be very hesitant to do it. The bad news, if this doesn't pass, there's going to be that additional $3+ billion of revenue they've got to find somewhere. And none of the options that are legal under today's Constitution are nearly as attractive as the one on the table now. Whether that's a flat income tax increase for everybody, whether it's a retirement tax increase, whether it's a sales tax increase on, you know, essential goods, the options to find that money, besides this option, are literally all worse.
Thank you,
I
David.
think some of the reason this might appeal to some folks and actually raise some fears is that, you know, the Constitution does not allow the taxing of state employees, for example, former teachers' incomes right now. And that I guess the idea is this is opening up the Constitution so they can do whatever they want. And I think that's where they're coming from.
Judy, I take your point, and I think your point about the sort of opening up the Constitution, fear-mongering is just right. Just the point of clarification: the Constitution does not prohibit the taxing of pensions.
Right.
It allows it today. The legislature by choice does not tax pensions. That's the way they created the income tax by law. They don't tax any retirement income, whether it's a pension or a 401k or anything else. But that's not protected by the Constitution, and they could change that tomorrow by going to Springfield and passing a law without input from the people. So for folks who think that's protected in the Constitution today, it just isn't.
Thank you for that clarification, Judy. Mary Kay Walsh asks, how does this change affect small businesses, which seem to have taken a huge hit during COVID-19 crisis?
I think the simplest thing to say here is that this is an income tax. It's a tax on net income. And so for individuals who get all their income through the business they own and have made $250,000 of net income that year, they will be paying a little bit more. Now, for the businesses that are unable to keep their doors open, that really are struggling because of COVID, they're not making a profit. They're not paying their owners more than $250,000 in salary. In fact, they're really affected quite negatively by property taxes, for example, which can be really difficult for small businesses, particularly small businesses just trying to get their, get off the ground. And so I know this is a really important question because it's a repeated line from the opposition. But the struggles that small businesses are undergoing now result in them not making a profit and therefore not paying any income tax. The technical answer to the question is that lots of businesses pay their income are kind of structured so that their earnings are passed through income, and so if the owner of the business takes over $250,000 in pass-through income, they would have this modest increase. The corporate tax rate also goes up actually very slightly, quite a bit less than I would have expected. But fundamentally, if you buy into the idea that taxes are a fundamental challenge for businesses, the taxes we're talking about aren't the ones they pay after they're done making a profit. It's the ones they pay that stop them from making a profit, like the sales tax and the property tax. And fundamentally, passing this thing is the only way we can ever get those other taxes to start to come down.
And I just want to add one thing to what Daniel said is to remember that ultimately for most businesses, this is going to be a tax cut because they're making under $250,000 a year. So it's not even about whether they'll be paying more, but at this time in this pandemic, this is an opportunity to give a little bit of tax relief for those businesses who are trying to make it work. Because if you're an S corporation or an LLC that's coming in the door that way, you're going to get some relief.
I want to, want to introduce Sam Tuttle, the Executive Director of Vote Yes for Fair Tax. Welcome, Sam. We're glad that you're here. Mary Kay, I'm hopeful that answers your question. And moving on to Ellie Hall, who asks, I favor the fair tax, but couldn't something be done to cut the state's expenses? And thinking especially of taxes, for example, in Wisconsin, pension increases are based on the cost of living. In Illinois, aren't there generally flat increases? I remember 3%.
Yes, I was thinking I'm generally concerned about the whole pension issue and the high percent that of the Illinois budget that's going to pensions.
Thank you, Ellie. I'm going to answer this question twice, actually, because there's a small answer and a big answer. And the small answer is that there is plenty of legitimate discussion to have about pensions and other expenditures and how to save money in various ways other than bringing in more revenue. In my opinion, that shouldn't get in the way of passing a constitutional amendment to make our tax system fair and begin to address our fiscal problems. This thing, if passed, is not going to solve the whole problem. There's going to be plenty of more opportunities to debate lots of other things. But I've noticed that the opponents, when they start losing the argument, they've started saying, okay, maybe this makes some sense, but we can't pass it unless we also do this other thing too. And I have to say that is a dangerous way to make progress. If you say we can't do good thing A until we all agree that some other controversial thing B is good too, then we never get anywhere. And so I would say the basic fundamental answer is these are important conversations. They're conversations I've spent a lot of blood, sweat, and tears on in my own life, and I'm sure will continue to do so. But I don't think they really address the question of whether we ought to pass this, because I don't think they address the question of whether this is an improvement on the status quo. And that, to me, is the question that we need to be answering when we're voting yes or no in November. But I understand that you're not asking this question in bad faith to change the subject. You're asking it because it's an important question that you care about. And so I wanted to first sort of model that answer you might give when you're talking to someone who's reading too many Chicago Tribune editorials, which is, for the record, any non-zero number of Chicago Tribune editorials. But I also want to address the question on the merits. The amount of money that the state has to pay toward pensions is really big and a problem. Now, back in 2010, legislation was passed that changed the very thing you're talking about. That says for anybody hired in 2011 or since. So if you know a teacher was hired in 2012, or me, for example, I was hired in the legislature in 2011, their cost of living on their pension is not a flat increase. It is tied to inflation. It's in fact lower than inflation. So many of those changes were already made. And the people who are beating the drum asking for more changes to get made are saying, yeah, we know you addressed the problem for people who've been hired since 2011. But what about the folks who were hired before 2011? What about the retired teacher? What about the person who's been teaching for 25 years and was hired 25 years ago under the old system? Well, the Illinois Constitution says that that person has a contractual right to keep the pension they were promised. They were offered the job with the pension was promised to them. You can't just go changing the rules on them halfway through their career. I personally think that's good. Others very strongly disagree. But that is what the Constitution says. That is how the Supreme Court has interpreted the Constitution. And as a practical matter, I just don't think there's any way around that. And so as we try to solve what is admittedly a very serious fiscal problem the state is facing, of which one component is the giant pension payments that we must make because of generations of failure to properly fund our pension systems, we have to have hard conversations and we have to come together in a spirit of compromise. But I don't think changing the pensions for people who are already in the system and have been made that constitutionally guaranteed promise is going to be a path forward that's going to work. And so I would respectfully suggest that we look elsewhere because I think we'll be beating our heads against the wall if we go back to that conversation again and again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. From Alyssa, someone I know argued that the passage of the fair tax will cause Illinois to shut down critical social services. I'm not sure where they got this argument. Have you heard it? How would you address that rhetoric if it was presented to you?
I've never heard that. This is a pretty complex speculation, but I will tell you that, the coalition trying to pass the fair tax has a lot of overlap with the coalition that tried to pass successfully the minimum wage increase. And so those arguments sound similar sometimes. I know that there was real concern that because unfortunately so many workers in the human service field are paid very, very low wages, that a minimum wage increase would negatively impact human service providers and cause shutdown as described. Now that's a different conversation. I have a whole different answer to that, but it's water under the bridge. The minimum wage already passed, which I'm pleased with. And so that discussion I'm familiar with. I haven't heard it suggested that a fair tax would affect social services in a negative way, because people who work in the human service field very, very rarely, if ever, would be paying more. And certainly the state's ability to fund human services would be enhanced by those $3+ billion coming in. So, I'll put my email address in the chat here. I'm happy to speak with anybody if I'm missing something, but I'm not familiar with that argument.
Thank you, Daniel. From Steve, the opposition says that this initiative opens the door to higher rates for many people, many more people. What should one reasonably expect for the rates into the future?
One should expect that the rates are going to be what we, the people, demand and what the elected officials want to enact based upon what they promise us during campaign time and what we ask of them. You know, the opposition loves to say that, oh, this thing Daniel said sounds really good. Only 3% of people are going to be paying more. Wow, nice deal. Oh, guess what? They're just coming to get you later. They're going to pass this now and raise the taxes of only the richest people. And then next year, they're going to come back and raise everybody else's taxes. And you know what I say to that? If the legislature's goal was to raise everybody else's taxes, they could do that tomorrow. They could already do that now. In fact, that's what we did back in 2017 when we voted to increase taxes to end the budget stalemate. We voted to raise taxes on everybody. I spent my whole life fighting for economic justice, and I voted to raise taxes on the poorest working people in Illinois because that was the only legal way to get the revenue that we needed to reopen the state government. That's what the law is today. What we're trying to do is change it so it's at least possible to do the right thing, give working people a break, and ask the wealthy to pay more. And I think we just need to be clear about that when we're challenged about that. Yeah, I don't know for sure what the legislature is going to do tomorrow, but what I know is if we don't pass this referendum, then next year when they've got to find more revenue, they can only do it in a way that goes after working people. But if we do pass this, they at least have the option not to go after working people. So in that sense, we're safer with this, not less safe.
Thank you. And Steve, I want to point out that in the chat, Sam Tuttle has put a link to some budget blog, CBTA online information that could help you to explore that a little further. From Ed and Ann White, what are the factors that changed the last 50 years of flat tax holding? Is the opposition weaker?
You know, I think Governor Pritzker deserves a lot of credit here. A lot of credit. You know, you can't run for governor of a place like Illinois and not have some theory and promise about what to do about the budget problems. And his answer was job number one was we got to pass a fair tax. And he was elected and he became governor and he gave his first budget address and he said job number one is we got to pass a fair tax. And then came time to pass their first budget and he really pushed the legislature hard, and eventually all the Democrats in the legislature voted to put the fair tax referendum on the ballot. I'll just be direct, you know, former politicians can say a lot of things. There's plenty of Democrats in the past who said they were for changing the Constitution to allow a fair tax, but they weren't really for pushing for it. They didn't say, I'm gonna take the responsibility to make sure this happens. They said, well, it's a good idea. Hopefully somebody else does that for me. That's what the previous two Democratic governors did. That's what a lot of my colleagues in the legislature said. Oh, I'm for it, but I don't want to have that fight. Governor Pritzker decided he needed to have that fight, and he's had that fight very effectively so far, but none of it matters unless we pass the referendum in a few months. And that's, of course, the hardest part of all. So we need to keep our shoulders to the wheel.
Great. And Irene Raven asks, what do you mean that the corporate tax goes up slightly? Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, the corporate tax rate, I think, goes from 7 to 7.9%. So it would continue to be a flat tax rate and a very modest increase, you know, from 7 to 7.9.
And I want to acknowledge that I am seeing people add answers in here, and I'm not reading those right now, but letting you, Daniel, take the floor with this. From Megan, also of concern, all of the debt service and economic impact of not fixing the budget. More time passes, we spend more and more money on borrowing to cover debt.
Yeah, exactly. That is, I mean, at its root, that is the same concern as the pension concern. Right? What happened with the pensions was for a century we never put enough money into these pension funds that we were supposed to use to keep our pension promises. There was never enough money there. Well, that's accruing debt, and it's a complicated way of saying it, but it's making a promise and not putting the money aside to pay out what you promised to pay out. That's debt. And so that grew and grew and grew and grew. And so now we're paying, you know, some incredible percentage of every tax dollar that comes into the state treasury, not because the pensions are so generous, but because we didn't pay in for so very long. Well, that disaster is replicated across the system, whether it's hard debt, like, oh, we borrowed money on the bond market and had to pay the bondholders back. You know, it's really nice to experience what we've experienced for now more than a decade of Illinois, of making sure the Wall Street bondholders get paid back first while social service agencies are shutting down, right? Think about the injustice that entails. So that's just more payments later because we can't properly fund things now. But there's also the example of what you might call soft debt, which is where if you don't pay what you need to pay now, you will incur some cost later. And the pensions is one example, but another example is just deferred maintenance at our universities. We haven't had the money to keep up the buildings and the physical plant at our universities. And that's just a giant bill that's accruing and accruing and accruing, but it's also affecting the quality of life of people who study and teach there. So, you know, the federal government is pretty fiscally unconstrained, right? The federal government's decisions about whether to spend $1 or $3 or $5 trillion on COVID relief, that's a political decision, not an economic decision. They can spend whatever they want to spend. It's not like that for state governments, unfortunately. And if we make promises that we haven't found the money to pay, then we're going to really pay for that in some serious, real human way down the road. We've got to fix that.
One final question in the chat. What is the strongest opposition to the amendment?
Rich people. You know, I think that the Chamber of Commerce, the kind of right-wing business lobby, the Republican establishment, you know, these organizations that are either funded by the very wealthy or kind of deeply ideologically opposed to taxing the wealthy, or just politically want to see Democrats and Governor Pritzker fail, have come together to form this alliance of opposition. You know, when you've got 97% of households do better under your plan, and you'd think you'd wind up with 97% of the votes, but of course the 3% that don't do better have a lot of money to spend on a campaign. And so that's really the challenge that we're facing. And again, I'm a very progressive person, and I believe in a lot of policies around economics and taxation that might be a tough sell for you know, certain moderate or independent people. But this one isn't one of them. This one isn't one of them. The idea that we shouldn't ask the poorest to pay double what the richest pay, that makes sense to everybody. The idea that if you make $5 million a year, you ought to pay a higher tax rate than the person who cleans your floors, that makes sense to everybody. And again, you can tell because not only is it true in most other states, but the other states aren't trying to change it, right? Scott Walker was the greatest hero of conservative economics imaginable. He didn't try to create a flat tax in Wisconsin. If you look at the Republican primary for president in 2016, you know, it's true that Ted Cruz wanted a flat tax on the federal level. But you know who didn't? Donald Trump, Marco Rubio, Jeb Bush, John Kasich. I could go on and on and on. If you walk outside the borders of Illinois, almost everybody, left, right, and center, agrees that you ought to have a fair tax system. And we're just trying to bring Illinois, forget the 21st century, we'd just like to bring Illinois up to the 20th century when most other states were already doing this. There's no question that some people who make millions and millions of dollars a year and actually would pay a bit more are never going to be persuaded, and they can use some of that money to fund television ads. But once you lay out these basic facts, most people are on our side.
Great. Any final thoughts, Daniel?
Well, I just want to say thank you. Such a robust collection of questions. It just makes my heart sing that so many people instinctively understand the connection between this very dry subject matter and deeply, deeply human questions like, can working people make it? Can we fund our schools? Can our human service providers stay open. That instinctive understanding that you have about the connection between these technical numbers and these deeply human things that we all care about is a gift. And my ask is that you share that gift with others between now and election time, that you help others who are with us on these core values, but haven't dug into the charts and the graphs and the numbers and are getting strong, aggressive messages from the other side. Just share with them for a moment, not the whole presentation and all that stuff, unless you think they're the sort of person who would like it, but the basic vision of this is about giving working people a chance to make it, giving a shot at funding schools properly, finally in this state that has done such violence to so many children for so many years, and having a social safety net that we all want anyway. And again, if people know that when they go vote, we'll have a pretty good outcome. So thank you for volunteering to share this vision.
I want to introduce now Jean Pierce, who is the Issues and Advocacy co-chair of the Illinois League of Women Voters. Jean is going to just talk a little bit about some of the history that brings us to this moment of looking at changing the Illinois Constitution with a referendum for fair tax. Jean, please.
Thank you. So August 18th is an important day for equity. 100 years ago today, the final state ratified the 19th Amendment. Passing the 19th Amendment was an important step towards ensuring that all citizens could vote. This is a core value of the League of Women Voters. And still, to this day, the League must remain vigilant to oppose efforts to interfere with the right to vote. For instance, today we're fighting against voting laws and regulations that impact high-stakes races in ways that disproportionately affect voters of color. Guided by our values, there is much that remains to be done as we advocate for voting rights, for improving elections, for controlling money in politics, redistricting, and voting by mail. At the same time, men and women in the League are playing an active role in advocating for other issues which are important to our members. For 50 years, the League of Women Voters of Illinois has supported a graduated rate income tax for the state. It made sense then, and it makes sense now. Why does the League believe that a graduated rate income tax is fair? And why have we supported it for so long? The fair tax meets two major League criteria. The first is equity and progressivity. The fair tax is based on the ability to pay. This is not the case with a flat tax. Currently, the lowest wage earners have twice the state and local tax burden of top income earners. A graduated rate tax will allow the state to apportion the burden more fairly. The second criterion is stability and responsiveness. By removing the current constitutional requirement that income can only be taxed at a flat rate, voters will allow the state to have more flexibility to design revenue structures that fit economic reality. This is important as the huge economic gap between rich and poor continues to grow. In addition, the fair tax will help raise money for programs that are valued by the League, equitable and adequate funding for education, for healthcare, for human services, for the environment, and for public safety. For decades, the state has kicked the can down the road, passing mounting debt to future generations. It's time to put Illinois on a steady path to meet its obligations with a modern income tax structure. That is why the League of Women Voters of Illinois is a proud supporter of the fair tax.